What I'm about to say may unsettle you, because it challenges the way most people think their spiritual life works. Imagine for a moment that everything you have been told about prayer, about attending Mass, about receiving the sacraments, has been happening while you are unknowingly standing inside a collapsing structure, and no one ever warned you the danger was there. I am Father Chad Ripperger, and for decades I have worked as an exorcist, confronting realities that most people, including many within the clergy, prefer to ignore or deny. What I am sharing is not meant to comfort you. It is meant to alert you. There is a battle taking place right now, but it is not visible on any news channel or battlefield map. It is not defined by nations or politics. It is a spiritual conflict, and it is happening in a realm most people no longer think about. The troubling reality is that many Catholics are entering this conflict without preparation, without understanding, and in some cases, without even realizing they are already affected by it. I have sat with people who were afflicted in ways that cannot be explained naturally. I have heard voices that did not belong to the person speaking. I have witnessed situations that left even experienced priests shaken. Yet in nearly every case, these individuals did not begin with deliberate wrongdoing. They were ordinary believers, people who attended Mass, people who prayed, people who believed they were safe. So the question becomes, how does this happen? How do ordinary families find themselves spiritually compromised without ever intending it? That is what I intend to explain, step by step. And by the end, you may find that your understandings of your own spiritual condition has completely changed. Let me begin with a question I have asked in seminaries, in private conversations with bishops, and in discussions with priests who have served for decades. When was the last time you heard a sermon about the devil? In most cases, the response is not a thoughtful answer. It is silence, often followed by an uncomfortable laugh or a remark about not wanting to scare people. That response, more than anything, reveals the crisis we are facing. Because the devil does not stop working simply because he is no longer mentioned. In fact, silence only benefits his activity. When attention is withdrawn from a real danger, that danger does not disappear. It grows unnoticed. The enemy does not need to hide when no one is looking for him. In the years following the Second Vatican Council, a shift occurred in how many parts of the Church presented themselves. The emphasis in many places moved toward being accepted by the world, toward avoiding anything that might appear harsh or uncomfortable. In that process, certain practices and emphases began to fade. Devotions that once strengthened spiritual awareness were reduced or removed. Explicit language about sin became less common. Discussions about spiritual warfare were often softened or avoided entirely. It is important to be precise here. Counsel itself is not the issue. The problem lies in how its aftermath was interpreted and applied in many contexts. Trying to make the Church more approachable, something essential was lost, a clear sense of spiritual reality. When everything becomes gentle and affirming, people stop recognizing that they are in a struggle that requires vigilance. At the same time, a shift in liturgical and devotional life took place in many communities. Practices that once reinforced spiritual discipline were gradually abandoned in some places. Reverence weakened in certain settings. And while God's love was emphasized, and rightly so, less attention was given to the reality of sin, consequence, and spiritual danger. But love without truth becomes incomplete. It does not protect. It only reassures. From my experience in deliverance ministry, I can say with certainty that spiritual affliction has not decreased in this period of silence. It has increased. The reason is not complicated. When spiritual discipline weakens, vulnerability increases. When protective practices are neglected, openings appear. Nature does not tolerate emptiness, and neither does the spiritual world. What often enters through that emptiness does not announce itself dramatically. It does not appear as obvious evil. It appears subtly. Persistent anxiety, unexplained anger, compulsions, emotional instability, breakdowns in family relationships, or an increasing inability to pray. Symptoms are often dismissed as purely psychological or circumstantial, but in many cases, they have deeper spiritual dimensions. I have seen this pattern repeatedly in families who considered themselves faithful. They were not engaged in overtly forbidden practices. They were not intentionally inviting anything harmful. But over time, without realizing it, they had allowed essential elements of spiritual life to fade. Prayer became irregular. Confession was rare. Discernment about what entered the home through media and entertainment was minimal. And slowly their spiritual defenses weakened. There is a passage in Scripture where St. Peter warns believers to remain sober and vigilant because the enemy moves like a roaring lion seeking to devour. That is not symbolic exaggeration. It is a description of spiritual reality. Yet in many modern contexts, such language is treated as outdated or metaphorical. This misunderstanding itself creates vulnerability. The most dangerous misconception today is the belief that spiritual danger only affects those who deliberately seek evil. In reality, many of the most severe cases I have encountered began in completely ordinary environments. A home can appear stable on the surface while slowly becoming spiritually disordered underneath. When I begin working with such families, I do not start with dramatic interventions. I begin by asking questions. Has there been engagement with occult practices, even casually? Has anything entered the home that opens spiritual doors, even unintentionally? In one case, a teenager had interacted with an online application designed around simulated spiritual communication. It seemed harmless at first, but it became a point of entry for deeper disturbance within the household. What must be understood is that spiritual influence does not require dramatic invitation. It often requires only consent given without understanding. Curiosity, when misdirected, can become an opening. From there, effects can spread into different areas of life, amplifying existing weaknesses rather than creating entirely new ones. This is why the spiritual life cannot be treated as secondary or optional. It is not one part of life among many. It is the foundation that supports everything else. When that foundation weakens, everything built upon it becomes unstable. And yet, despite all of this, most people continue as if nothing is happening. That is perhaps the most serious danger of all. Not active rebellion, but passive ignorance. Because what is ignored is often what becomes most influential. In the next part, we will look more closely at how this weakening occurs within families that believe they are practicing their faith correctly, and why small gaps in spiritual discipline can produce consequences far greater than most people realize. The weakening often does not begin with a dramatic decision or a sudden rejection of faith. It begins in ways so small that they are almost impossible to notice at first. A missed prayer here, a postponed confession there, gradual shift where spiritual practices that once felt essential start to feel optional. Over time, what was once a structured life of faith becomes something more irregular, shaped by convenience rather than conviction. In many families I have worked with, the decline does not look like rebellion. It looks like distraction. Life becomes busy, schedules become tighter, and spiritual habits begin to adjust around everything else instead of anchoring it. Prayer, which once structured the day, reduced to brief moments when there is time left. The Rosary, once prayed together, becomes occasional or disappears entirely. Sunday Mass remains, but it becomes more isolated from daily life rather than the center of it. What is important to understand is that these changes rarely feel like loss while they are happening. They feel practical, reasonable, even necessary. But spiritually, something significant is shifting. When prayer becomes inconsistent, interior strength begins to weaken. Not in a way that is immediately visible, but in a way that gradually reduces resistance to temptation, confusion, and discouragement. Confession is another area where this gradual weakening becomes especially serious. When it is approached rarely, or only when a person feels overwhelming guilt, it stops functioning as regular spiritual healing. Instead of being a consistent cleansing of the soul, it becomes a crisis response. This changes the internal structure of conscience. People begin carrying burdens longer than they should. They normalize interior tension that was never meant to be permanent. Over time, this affects how a person thinks, acts, and interprets their own emotions. Guilt that is not resolved does not disappear. It transforms, can become anxiety, irritability, numbness, or even spiritual exhaustion. And when that internal state becomes normal, person slowly loses clarity about their own condition. Another major factor is what enters the mind and heart through constant exposure to media and entertainment. Many people underestimate how deeply repeated images, themes, and ideas shape their interior life. It is not only about obvious moral concerns, it is about formation. What you repeatedly expose yourself to begins to influence what you consider normal, acceptable, or even desirable. In modern life, there is very little intentional filtering of this input. Content is consumed continuously, often without reflection. Hours are spent absorbing narratives that have no connection to faith, or worse, that actively contradict it. Over time, creates a divided interior life. On one hand, there is belief in God. On the other hand, there is a steady stream of influences that form a completely different worldview. This division weakens spiritual coherence. Person begins to think in one way during prayer and another way during daily life. The unity between faith and action slowly fractures. And once that unity is weakened, decision-making becomes inconsistent, especially in moments of stress or temptation. In many cases, families do not realize how much this fragmentation has progressed until serious problems appear. Conflict increases. Communication breaks down. Emotional reactions become more intense and less controlled. At that point, people often look for external explanations, but the internal structure that has been developing for years is usually not considered. There is also the issue of spiritual identity within the home. A Catholic home is not only defined by the presence of religious symbols or occasional practices. It is defined by a consistent orientation toward God that shapes how decisions are made, how conflict is handled, and how suffering is understood. When that orientation weakens, the home does not become neutral. It becomes spiritually unanchored. And when a home is unanchored, it becomes more susceptible to disorder. Not immediately, and not always in obvious ways, but gradually. Small tensions become larger conflicts. Minor misunderstandings become persistent divisions. Emotional wounds are not healed in the light of faith, but left to develop on their own. At this stage, many people assume the problem is purely psychological or relational, and those dimensions are certainly real. But from a spiritual perspective, what is often missing is protection. Not protection in a superstitious sense, but in the form of structured spiritual life that strengthens the will, clarifies the mind, and orders the emotions. Without that structure, people rely entirely on their own strength, which is often not enough under sustained pressure. This is where discouragement begins to take root, not as a sudden crisis, but as a slow erosion of hope, patience, and resilience. I have encountered families where no single moment of collapse could be identified. Instead, there was a long chain of small compromises, each one understandable on its own, but collectively significant. Prayer delayed too often becomes prayer forgotten. Confession postponed too long becomes confession avoided. Discernment neglected too often becomes vulnerability to anything that fills the silence. And silence is never empty for long. When spiritual life is not actively cultivated, other influences begin to occupy that space. They may not appear hostile at first. In fact, they often appear harmless or even helpful. But over time, they reshape priorities, attention, and interior stability. This is why the church has always emphasized discipline, not as a burden, but as protection. Regular prayer is not simply a tradition. It is a structure that stabilizes the soul. Confession is not only forgiveness, it is restoration of order. Fasting is not punishment. It is training in freedom from excess. When these elements are present, create a kind of spiritual resilience that is difficult to understand until it is absent. What I have observed repeatedly is that when these disciplines fade, people do not immediately feel weaker. They feel freer. But that sense of freedom is deceptive. It is not strength without structure. It is vulnerability without awareness. And so the condition progresses quietly, External life may appear normal, even successful. But internally there is less clarity, less stability, and less resistance to negative influences, whether emotional, psychological, or spiritual. Eventually, this interior weakening begins to manifest in visible ways: broken relationships, persistent unrest, loss of direction, and in some cases, experiences that cannot be easily explained within natural categories alone. But by the time these symptoms appear, underlying patterns have often been in place for years. This is why early awareness is critical. Not fear, not obsession, but awareness. Understanding that spiritual life cult is not maintained automatically. It either grows through intentional practice or weakens through neglect. In the next part, we will examine how this weakening is often misunderstood in modern thinking and why many people interpret spiritual problems purely through psychological or cultural explanations while missing the deeper dimension entirely. As these patterns continue over time, something more subtle begins to happen in how people interpret their own experiences. What is essentially a spiritual decline is often reinterpreted through entirely different frameworks. In modern thinking, almost every internal struggle is assigned a psychological, emotional, or social explanation. But while these explanations can be valid in many cases, they are not always complete. The result is that a person may experience genuine interior disorder, but only understand it in natural terms. Anxiety becomes purely chemical or situational. Irritability is reduced to stress. A loss of motivation is explained as burnout. Relationship breakdowns are attributed only to communication issues or personality differences. These may all be contributing factors, but they do not always capture the full reality of what is happening. When the spiritual dimension is removed from interpretation entirely, something important is lost: clarity about cause and effect. People begin treating symptoms without recognizing the deeper structure that produces them. It is similar to addressing the smoke while ignoring the fire. Progress becomes limited because the source is never fully confronted. This is one of the reasons why many individuals cycle through temporary solutions without lasting resolution. They may seek advice, therapy, lifestyle changes, or new routines, and while these can bring some improvement, underlying instability remains if the deeper foundation is not addressed. Without spiritual grounding, the interior life lacks cohesion, and without cohesion, stability is difficult to maintain. In my experience, one of the clearest signs of this disconnect is the inability to sustain its interior peace even in favorable circumstances. A person may have stability in work, relationships, and health, yet still experience persistent unrest. This is often interpreted as personal failure or emotional dysfunction, but it can also indicate a deeper disorientation within the spiritual life itself. Modern culture tends to assume that if external conditions improve, internal peace will naturally follow. But that is not always the case. Interior life does not automatically align with external comfort. In fact, without spiritual order, increased comfort can sometimes even amplify restlessness, because distraction replaces meaning, not disorder. Another important factor is the loss of objective moral reference points. When moral truth becomes relative or individualized, conscience loses its anchoring structure. Decisions are then guided more by preference than by principle. This may feel liberating at first, but over time it produces instability because the internal decision-making process lacks consistency. When conscience is no longer formed by a stable moral framework, it becomes reactive. It shifts based on emotion, environment, and social influence, creates an internal fragmentation where a person may hold contradictory beliefs depending on context. One version of the self appears in religious settings, another in private life, and another in social or digital environments. Fragmentation is not just philosophical. It has practical consequences. It affects how people respond to temptation, how they handle guilt, and how they interpret their own actions. Without a stable moral center, self-justification becomes more common and self-awareness becomes more limited. Over time, this weakens the ability to make consistent choices, especially under pressure. At the same time, Spiritual language itself becomes unfamiliar. Concepts like sin, grace, repentance, and spiritual warfare are often viewed as outdated or symbolic, rather than real categories describing lived experience. When these concepts are removed from serious consideration, entire dimensions of human experience become harder to interpret accurately. What then happens is a kind of narrowing of perception. People still experience spiritual realities, but they interpret them through incomplete categories. Restlessness becomes only stress. Temptation becomes only habit. Moral struggle becomes only psychology. The result is not that these realities disappear, but that they are misunderstood. And misunderstanding has consequences. When a problem is misdiagnosed, the solution is often ineffective. This is why many individuals feel that despite sincere effort, something remains unresolved. They are addressing real symptoms, but not always the correct level of reality. Another consequence of this narrowing is a gradual weakening of spiritual discernment. Discernment is the ability to recognize what is leading a person toward God and what is pulling them away. When spiritual language and categories are no longer actively used, this ability becomes less intuitive. Choices are then made without a clear sense of their spiritual direction. This does not usually happen suddenly. It happens through repetition, through habits of interpretation that slowly reshape perception. Over time, what once felt spiritually obvious becomes unclear. The distinction between helpful and harmful influences becomes blurred. In this condition, people are more easily influenced by whatever is most immediate or emotionally compelling. This is not necessarily because they lack intelligence or sincerity, but because the internal framework that supports discernment has weakened. Without a stable reference point, decisions become more reactive than reflective. This is also where confusion often increases in religious life itself. Practices may continue outwardly, but their meaning becomes less integrated internally. Prayer may still occur, but it may feel less connected to lived reality. Faith may still be professed, but it may not consistently shape interpretation of daily experiences. Over time, creates a gap between belief and experience. A person may believe in God, attend Mass, and still feel disconnected from the spiritual meaning of those practices. That gap is often not immediately recognized, but it contributes to a growing sense of spiritual distance or fatigue. At this stage, many people do not abandon faith. Instead, gradually reduce its influence on decision-making. It becomes one aspect of life among others, rather than the central organizing principle. And when faith is no longer central, other influences naturally take its place. What must be understood is that this shift rarely feels like a decline while it is happening. It often feels like adaptation, feels like balancing multiple aspects of modern life. But spiritually, it represents a change in hierarchy. And when the hierarchy changes, everything built upon it eventually shifts as well. In the next part, we will explore how this internal fragmentation affects families and communities more broadly, and why the weakening of spiritual structure at the individual level inevitably produces visible effects at the collective level as well. As this internal fragmentation deepens at the individual level, it does not remain contained there. Human beings are not isolated systems. They are deeply interconnected through family life, relationships, and shared environments. What begins as a quiet weakening in one person's interior life eventually influences the emotional and spiritual stability of those closest to them. Families, this often appears first in communication. Conversations that were once natural and open begin to feel strained or unpredictable. Small misunderstandings carry more emotional weight than before. Patience decreases, reactions become sharper. Over time, a subtle shift occurs where the home no longer feels like a place of consistent emotional refuge, but rather a space where tension can surface unexpectedly. This does not usually happen because people suddenly stop caring for one another. In most cases, they care deeply, but their interior stability has been reduced, and when interior stability weakens, emotional responses become less regulated. The ability to interpret situations calmly is replaced by quicker, more reactive patterns of thought and feeling. In such environments, conflict is often misinterpreted as purely relational or psychological. While those factors are certainly present, they do not always explain why similar patterns begin appearing across multiple members of the same household. When multiple individuals begin experiencing unrest, anxiety, or emotional instability at the same time, it suggests that something more systemic is occurring within the shared environment. A home is not just a physical structure. It is also a spiritual and emotional atmosphere shaped by the habits, choices, and interior lives of those who live within it. When that atmosphere is ordered, it supports clarity, peace, and resilience. When it becomes disordered, it amplifies stress, confusion, and emotional instability. One of the most overlooked aspects of this dynamic is the loss of shared spiritual practice within families. When prayer is no longer practiced together, when faith is no longer expressed collectively, the individual becomes more isolated in their spiritual life. This isolation weakens the sense of shared purpose and shared protection that once helped stabilize the household. Without that shared foundation, family members may still function together on a practical level, but the deeper sense of unity begins to erode. People may live under the same roof, but their internal worlds become increasingly separate. Over time, this can create emotional distance that is difficult to recognize at first because daily routines continue as normal. In this context, external influences become more powerful. Media, social environments, and cultural messages begin to shape individuals more strongly than shared family values. This is not always intentional. It happens gradually through constant exposure and repetition. And because it is gradual, it is rarely noticed until its effects are already well established. Children are particularly sensitive to this shift. Their interior formation is still developing, which means they absorb and integrate influences more directly. When spiritual grounding is weak or inconsistent at home, external environments play a much larger role in shaping their understanding of identity, morality, and purpose. This is why the weakening of spiritual structure in a household rarely affects only one generation. It tends to extend across generations unless intentionally addressed. Patterns of disconnection, instability, or confusion can repeat themselves because the underlying formation has not been corrected. At the same time, modern life often reinforces this fragmentation rather than counteracting it. Families spend more time in parallel digital environments than in shared reflective or spiritual spaces. Even when physically together, attention is frequently divided. Each person is engaged with separate streams of information, entertainment, or communication. Creates a condition where physical proximity does not necessarily translate into emotional or spiritual unity. People may be together, but not fully present to one another. Over time, this reduces the depth of relational bonds and weakens the shared sense of identity that traditionally helps sustain family stability. When spiritual life is absent from this picture, there is no higher reference point that binds these experiences together. Without that reference, person begins to interpret life primarily through personal feeling and individual perspective. It increases subjectivity and reduces shared understanding. As subjectivity increases, so does the potential for misunderstanding. Tensions are misread more easily. Emotional responses escalate more quickly. Resolution becomes harder to achieve because there is no stable framework for returning to common ground. In this environment, even minor stressors can become significant sources of conflict. Financial pressure, health concerns, or external responsibilities can amplify existing instability rather than being processed in a balanced way. The family unit, instead of acting as a stabilizing force, begins to reflect the internal fragmentation of its members. It is important to understand that none of this happens overnight. It is the result of gradual shifts in practice, attention, and interior formation. Because the changes are incremental, they often go unrecognized until the cumulative effect becomes too large to ignore. At that point, families may begin searching for solutions, but they often look only at surface-level issues. They may attempt to improve communication, manage stress, or adjust routines, which can certainly help. However, if the deeper structural issue is not addressed, underlying instability often remains. The deeper issue is the absence of a unifying spiritual center that orders both individual and collective life. Without that center, everything else becomes more fragile. Relationships require more effort to maintain. Emotional resilience becomes harder to sustain. And the overall sense of stability within the home becomes more dependent on external circumstances. What is often not recognized is that this condition is reversible, but not automatically, requires intentional restoration of practices that rebuild interior order. Without that